Welcome to the weekly Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's show brought to you by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. We're on social media. Check us out at Facebook and Twitter at SWGM Podcast. If you like what we do, you want to be a part of it, throw us a buck on Patreon, patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. Visit the YouTube channel. Stop by youtube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Like, subscribe, share, tell a friend. We're past 1,000 subscribers at this point. Feel free also to subscribe to the iTunes podcast, itunes.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And if you're watching the live stream tonight, feel free to participate in that chat. We do bring it into the show. Nailed the entire intro like a boss. With the exception of one thing, we do have a new Patreon to give a shout out to. Go ahead, Dustin.
We'd like to thank Remy Bildois. Remy, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but thank you for being one of our patrons. Welcome aboard. Welcome to the party.
Thank you, Mr. B. See how I got around that? See what I did there? Yeah. Okay, so tonight's topic, light at the end of the tunnel and other train metaphors for a railroad. Choo-choo, choo-choo. So if you listen to one of the other Savage Worlds podcasts in the space, The Wild Die, like I tend to do as well, they had a very interesting discussion this week, this recent episode about railroading, especially as it comes down to plot point campaigns. I don't think the intent of the discussion was to talk about railroading, but that tangent led to some interesting conversation that I think is deserving to be continued here a little bit. As an expansion.
I would have to re-listen to the intro to that, but I do believe they have a topic that they were going to get to that they never did because they took a user question from email and never got past the question.
Yep. And it's interesting because the question was about plot point campaigns and how to run plot point campaigns and how to keep players interested in a plot point campaign. And it turned into a little bit of a diatribe by the host about stringent to the left player agency, stringent to the right, Gary. We will have efficiency. This is my story. If we will play it the way I want to play it, approach.
So I just want to go on record here right away because he calls me out directly as the person who's the anti to him for player agency, and I don't necessarily disagree. I am very pro sandbox. Don't sit down without a plan and just run and be very reactionary to your players. With that said, what Gary is talking about is I have 30 books stacked next to me, all of which with a great story. So I want to run right through them as fast as possible so I can see all of them. And in that light, if he's telling his players during session 0, hey, we're playing this story all aboard, then they're signing up for it. There's nothing wrong with it.
I agree. I don't necessarily think, and I think he brings up a very good point too. We pick on Gary, but much love, Gary. We've had you on the show before. Yeah. You're welcome back anytime. Sorry, my bad. I didn't think to invite you when we were talking about this. It just didn't dawn on me.
I really think we should invite him later on, or maybe one of us goes over so that we can have a whole crossover bit.
You know what? We'll bring him back for the Quantum Ogre podcast. We're going to discuss the Quantum Ogre podcast. He can guest host that one. But he brings up a very good point about being a little pushy as a GM when it comes to storytelling because you've invested in prep, you've invested in setting this up, but more than anything else. I think one of the things that he really has a good angle on, a good question on is, well, when you open it up and you don't come to the table with a story and start laying down tracks for a railroad, you just sit there and walk into a completely open sandbox, look at players and go, what do you want to do? It's crickets and tumbleweeds and what? And then nothing happens.
And to a certain extent, I understand that. You have to give the players something to react to. But the difference between Gary is setting the bar really high for what he's expecting from his players. He had said he's only ever had one player add anything to the game, and that's a player who inserted NPCs that the GM never said were in the scene, created a story that the GM never pitched, and just like took over the GM role for a few minutes as the storyteller of the game. That's a pretty high bar to set on player addition to the game. Like, I've done some shit to Jared in the past where it's like, I'll just announce there's a door over here and I'm going through it. And Jared's like, well, fuck, I guess there's now a door in that wall that there wasn't supposed to be there. But even that, I think I've done, I could probably count on one hand the times I've done it in the last several years, because it's just not the role of the player to invent the narrative whole cloth. Now, I will certainly take a 90-degree turn and head off into Albuquerque when Jared places the, here's the four-way stop ahead of you. The story is to the right, and I'll go left just to do it. And that's me adding to the story, my character's actions and reactions to the world that don't necessarily follow what the plot point campaign says that we should do. That's more important, I think, for that. By the flip side, your players can add to the story within a railroad by taking actions that reinforce the railroad. And a great example of this, we were playing The Flood. And Jared launches the flood. He's got the whole train wreck and the storm that you have to survive. And the only way you can survive is by going in the hole. And I've got a freaking action card that lets me summon a wagon train from nowhere that'll take us to any city nearby that I choose as a player not to play, because it would take us way off the story that we all signed up. We wanted to play the flood at that point. It's kind of my job as a player to go along with the flood, not go the other direction.
Right.
What is ironic, Eric Lemery actually ran, and I'm getting a major echo going through here, guys. Eric Lemery ran the flood at one point, and the players took a major turn and ended up in New Mexico instead of going to California. And he had to build an entire impromptu campaign off of that. They ended up fighting Hellstrom. I think you guys should go back and check out that playlist. It was kind of funny how far from the actual plot point he went. So I'm thinking we need to get him on the Quantum Ogre episode too.
Well, let's talk real quickly too. Just I think we always assume that everybody who listens to this knows what the jargon is. So I just want to kind of reset a little bit in case there's any new listeners or people who are brand new to Savage Worlds as a game system. We're talking about a plot point campaign. The idea of a plot point campaign is it's a series of interconnected adventures that provide a meta arc or overall storyline for the world.
Let's just use some old school terminology. Plot point campaigns are modules. That's all they are. Pinnacle came up with their own term so that they can brand the thing, but they're the old school adventure module that just chains right together to tell the story.
But the idea of it is that it's open. It should be open and flexible enough to where if you want to go off the beaten path and run 3 or 4 sessions, you can, and then find your way back to it. But it's supposed to basically provide a backbone, interesting story that kind of pulls the curtain back for the players to kind of see, oh, this is why Deadlands is Deadlands. This is some big thing, a big part of the story, the campaign world story. So with that said, if the players decide not to follow the breadcrumb trail, the railroad track, then let's talk about that, because we've talked about this as a philosophy on this show before, where, okay, well, if the players decide not to do this obvious plot hook thing that you lay in front of them, that story doesn't just die. It keeps growing and progressing and doing its own thing in the background. Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. And eventually it may come back and cross over with wherever the characters are in the storyline or their campaign.
So in an effort not to spoil any of the adventures that are out there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer specifically to the very first plot point adventure for ETU, because we've talked about it on the show. We've damn near run it on the show, where the player characters are supposed to go to kind of the the freshman orientation and there's supposed to be this specific event that happens. If you've got player characters who choose not to go to freshman orientation, then you run whatever adventure the players would normally have done, and the day after freshman orientation, they wake up to the stadium having burned down because they weren't there to stop the big event that's supposed to happen. And that's a great example of all you're supposed to do at that point is say, this story is still going on, whether the players interacted with it or not. And it's a storytelling mechanic that I think the plot point campaign and some of the more recent kind of hippy-dippy storytelling games like Fate and whatnot rely on the GM being very familiar with actual plot structures and being able to run plot line A, plot line B, and plot line C. A being your main plot that ties every adventure together, plot B being the main plot that you're running for that night, and plot C are all the internecessary little side stories based on a specific NPC or a specific player character interaction that's going to happen. You're supposed to wrap and tie all that together to run a proper plot point campaign. And I think that if you're not familiar with what an A plot is, or a B plot is, or a C plot, or how to intermingle those, that a plot point campaign can be exceptionally daunting to run. And there's not a lot of tips on how to run it in the GM section of the book or in any of the plot point campaign books, because the plot point campaign books themselves are just, here's the skeleton and all the tools, but nothing to actually teach you how to use those tools.
Right.
So here's something I want to bring up, kind of based off of that. You're right, Dave. But this is the idea that someone has to be the prime mover. And I think going off of what Gary said is that if the players don't want to be the prime mover, then the GM, there's this mentality that the GM has to. Otherwise, you look across the table, you say, what do you do? And people are like, what do you mean? What do I do? You're the GM. So we got this situation where the GM is told to create a story that is engaging and entertaining, and then punished because he does. Well, catch-22, though, don't you think?
Well, and I think this touches a bit on what Gary was talking about in his, where he said that you're a bullshit GM if you take less than 40 minutes to prep every session. That you're not bringing enough to the table as the GM if you're not spending that time in prep, knowing the story, knowing the characters, etc. And I think the unfortunate aspect of that is that's a very narrow way of looking at it. And it's based solely on, I'm a GM who runs other people's stuff. Therefore, I kind of have to learn it backwards and forwards so that I can run it. But if you're more like myself, or I know Jib has talked about this extensively, that for Jib, he's creating that world whole cloth with the players at the table. There's nothing to prep for because he doesn't know what new thing the players are going to add to his game world beforehand. In my case, I might let a player make a knowledge roll and they tell me what it is that they know about this creature, and that becomes part of my GM notes, that every time they come up against the bullywug, it has X power that this player told me when they made that successful knowledge roll, because that's a cooperative storytelling mechanic pulled right from the game. But again, not everyone runs that way. This is where Gary is very... He is very authoritative that this is what it takes to be a good GM, but it's really, this is what it takes to be a good GM if you play like Gary.
Right. And that's the difference. I mean, you have one person that wants that set kind of structure that the story can go through, but you have another one that is very improv. And improv GMs are like, and Dave, you have actually mentioned in the past, it's like the whole mentality of the yes and the no but mentality of thinking. And I think when you adopt that yes and no but, sort of like track in your mind, you start flowing, but if you don't adopt that, then the only thing you have is the next plot point, the next step in the module. How do you get through this?
Yes and no. I don't want to say that the typical GM who's running, a quote unquote railroad, right, where we're going to run everything that's in the plot point campaign and nothing else. I don't want to say that they're not doing yes ands or no buts. Oftentimes, though, what they're doing is they're over relying on a tool, whether that tool is the write-up that's provided in the plot point campaign, whether that tool is they always do yes and, or they always do no but. They're so dedicated to that tool that they're not letting the other tools be used. You can build a house with nothing but a handsaw and a hammer, but I guarantee if you use some of the other tools in the carpenter's toolkit, you're going to have a better house at the end of the day, or at least you're going to have a house that's just as good, but took you less time to build.
Probably more level too.
Yeah. Yeah. Plum. Who knew? I don't necessarily disagree with Gary. I think Gary is a little still mired in D&D-isms. From what I hear is he's got a certain, and it's the way he was raised by the gaming that he was influenced by is, you get maps of locations, what your monsters are statted out for, you build the encounter from the ground up, and then you show up and you play that adventure you've done. And if people want to go and walk away from the scene or the set that you made, well, screw them, go play another game because this is what we're doing. And
that's also rooted, I think, not just, and Gary talked extensively about having like 30 years experience, and that's the game he played for most of those 30 years. But part of that is also, you can't do in D&D what you can do in Savage Worlds. I can't just throw a mob on the table and say it has a D6 and everything, a D8 and one thing, and pick a monstrous ability to hand it and run that in D&D, because it has to be built through their little calculations for how many points and it's worth for encounter-wise and all that. That game has got a very different prep structure. So you have to put that amount of time into prep, and he's so used to that it becomes rote. But rather than focusing this just on what Gary had said during that, I think the other thing to look at is, with a plot point campaign, obviously they provide the A plot. They also provide the B plot fairly well. And then they provide a secondary B plot, not a C plot. That's up to the GM entirely in a plot point campaign. Right. But the secondary B plot are what they call Savage Tales. And these are the individual things that aren't part of the main skeleton plot point that you can run between them as secondary adventures. And that's all great. But again, if you don't know how to weave those in to the A plot as secondary B plots, and if you don't know how to weave in C plots that tie directly to what your players put on their character sheets for hindrances, that tie directly to the friends and allies and all of that the players run into during the game, if you don't do that well, you're not going to have as enjoyable of an experience.
Right. Well, and here's the thing too. I want to say that the trick to GMing anything is being flexible enough to be more of a theme park, than a sandbox, and be able to step off that stage. So I've created this little adventure that's taking place in the world, and it's happening here in this space, in this tavern, and I have plots that I know are going to occur, and I know what's going to happen and how the NPCs are going to react if the player does A, B, or C. What I'm not prepared for is when the players do D or X. And I have to know my own theme park. I have to know what exists to some degree that makes sense outside of that saloon. So when they decide to go, you know what? I'm out. And they step out the front doors of the saloon, there's still a story to tell. I can still follow them outside that saloon, even if I'm going into the dangerous world of having not prepped. I don't have maps. I don't have stat blocks. But with Savage Worlds, I don't necessarily need any of that because I don't have to break out miniatures and count hexes in order to have a combat. I can do it theater of the mind with that system with Savage Worlds. I can do things on the fly. I can pick up and know, hey, most of the stats are going to be a D6. I know from running it what it's going to be. But I think the thing is, you have to know the theme park as the world you're playing in, and each little section is its own continent or its own time and place in the story, and trying to run with that. Because there was some conversation too about quantum ogreism that I want to kind of talk about as well.
Before we jump to that, though, I think what you just said is a great entry point for Sunset Sam's question.
All right, let's go ahead and throw it up there.
So Sunset Sam said, and yet there is an understanding that players should run characters that want to engage in the world. Going off rails is different from avoidance. And here's the primary thing to that. Playing a character that wants to get involved with the world doesn't necessarily mean that character wants to get involved with the A plot. And a great example of this, the Friday night zombie game. And in this case, I'm not ruining anything. So I've bowed out for a few weeks due to some medical issues. But the Friday night zombie game had this A plot that involved the military kind of crashing in and taking over and being kind of this unmovable mover that is going to exist in the game world, and you're going to have to work around them. And the character that I had a very specific cornerstone to that character was that they could not stand and would not listen to the military. Therefore, my character actively avoiding the military and not engaging with this A plot was an appropriate C plot for that game. But had I just said, okay, well, I mean, my character just shoots the captain in the head and then turns and leaves, that would be I'm avoiding the A plot. Instead, my character being on the run and accepting the fact that the military is going to chase him, that is a proper way of interacting with that A plot of the military being there based on what the character would do without fully avoiding it. And so I think there's a way that you can play a character that doesn't want to do the thing that's going on in the game without having that character be antagonistic to the fun of the whole group playing the game of, zombies or ETU or whatever it is you're doing. There's a difference between avoiding the setting and the conceit of the game and avoiding an aspect of it because your character would naturally avoid it.
Now, I want to jump in on this too. So pardon me while we have let me tell you about my character moment, because this is relevant to our discussion here. So in putting that game world together, I know that there are certain sections of the country where the military has a strong presence. They're trying to rebuild law and order. That's an element that's taking place in that game world. I know that certain areas in the continent are radioactive. I know that there are other things going on. I know pretty much what's happening in a very broad general stroke, pretty much everywhere in the U.S. during the zombie outbreak, and what it leads to and how it's happening. The fact that Dave's character and more than one character has this defiance issue as a hindrance, like I do not abide the military. I don't like taking orders from anybody. Mixed with a group who are really, really into finding security and safety, bringing that plot point to bear in reaction to the way they've created the characters is an intentional thing the GM should do. That wasn't necessarily part of the railroad, but part of a cooperative storytelling event. So the reason in the game, right, they survive the outbreak, they actually miss the outbreak, stumble into it, oh crap, and then find their way to a farm and end up going, we're going to set up shop here. It's going to be awesome. Well, sooner or later as the GM, I know that in this world, the military is going to come in and seize that farm and set it up as a fob. It's going to be a forward operating base. So having that happen with that character there makes sense to do as the GM. And you're not railroading the character. You're giving those characters who have this, I don't like the military, I don't want to engage in that part of the story, having to coincide and work together along with the other players that are, yeah, but the security, man, they've got all the weapons, they've got all the medicine, all the food. Yeah, but they're going to do this to us or that to us. Is interesting gameplay.
Well, there's also just the aspect that if a player put that on their character sheet, the player is indicating they want the military to be part of the game, regardless of whether their character is going to be accepting of it. And I think that's the other aspect of this, is that those C plot lines, the ones that are entirely driven by character sheets, those are entirely up to the GM to look at, one, what the character has written down for edges and hindrances, contacts, things like that. Maybe their background if you do the whole give me a player a character bio. But it's also, oh, look, you pissed off the captain of the guard. Now the captain of the guard is going to become a C plot. He's going to come up more often. I'm going to remember that the captain of the guard's name is this, and he felt wronged by you. So the next time you're in town, that's another C plot that I'm going to weave in.
So I've got a C plot that actually grew naturally out of the story. So Roos is actually running a zombie apocalypse game, and during that game, one of the players ran over a zombified child. And later on throughout the story, my character died, and I had to come up with a new character. So I thought, you know what? The governor was probably one of the best characters on the TV show of The Walking Dead. So I made it to where my new character was the father of the child that got run over and had been looking for the person that ran over their kid. And I, as the player, knew that the person that did it was in the party. She was there. But my character didn't. So we had this C plot develop out of the fact that everybody knew and was just waiting for the shoe to drop.
Right. Metagame component to the game, right? And yeah, it's absolutely. Let's kind of have the conversation then. So let me ask you this, Dustin. What do you do when a player kills Harold Abraham Lincoln?
I make the director of the that sent them out on that mission. I make her pine for the loss and tell the party to just get the hell out of her sight. And then I create another C plot in which they're going to try and impersonate her, and now the party has to figure out how to sneak that person in and get the other person out.
So I think there's this interesting aspect, and we've talked about this a little bit when Chris was on the show, when he was running, I want to say it was War of the Walkers, where the players are supposed to walk into this room and get captured by this net, and instead, like, his players did something so utterly beside the point that just never happened, and he had to write this entire secondary adventure to bring them back to the point that the plot point says they're going to be at, because they were supposed to have been captured in the net. I think there's two aspects to this, and this touches on the Quantum Ogre, so it'll allow us to step right into that. But I think there's two ways to handle that. One is the true, like, Quantum Ogre response, which is the story is to the right, the players choose to go left, and you just pick up that encounter and move it. That is the wrong response, in my opinion. I've heard a lot of people, and even in that podcast that they did on the Wild Eye, where they talked about, oh, well, if this is the adventure they're supposed to run into, they find it wherever they go. And I think Gary used the example of, the flood, where regardless of where on the train the players come out, they find the hole, and they must go in the hole. Regardless of where the players wake up, they're being attacked by the Indians to force them in the hole. That's the Quantum Ogre. That is specifically putting your players in a situation, and when they choose not to engage with that and go a different direction, you just move the situation to where they went to. That is the Quantum Ogre. A lot of people are going to tell you it's bad. A lot of people are going to tell you shouldn't do it. I'm going to tell you it's a violation of the player's agency. It means that the choice they made doesn't matter. But if you and your players are okay with that, rock out with your bad self, I guess. Personally, I would not be happy in that situation if I kept making choices and the GM kept taking those choices away from me because they just kept moving the thing I was walking away from to be in front of me. That would upset me as a player, so I wouldn't have fun in that regard. The other aspect to this, though, and it's way more important, is that, and it's probably the reason that railroad became a term and why the railroad term has kind of been twisted to mean something new, is we come to the fork in the road, the story is to the right, we go left, and a player character gets hit by a lightning bolt, a flaming tree falls and cuts off the road. These are manners of the GM literally punishing the characters for player choices, not because the choice had consequences, but because the GM is upset the players didn't go down the plot hook. They didn't swallow the plot hook, line, and sinker and get dragged along the rails. They chose to go the other direction. So here is the quote-unquote barrier I'm putting in place, and this is the thing I'm taking away from you as the penalty for not doing the thing you were supposed to do. You broke the rules, so here I'm going to penalize you. And that is what initially created the term railroad, is the player characters getting run over by the plot wagon constantly to knock them back on that trail that they were supposed to be on.
Right. The idea being that originally there was no choice. There's one path in the dungeon. There's only one left turn at this point in the dungeon. You're just on the track to the dungeon, and players go, I don't feel like I have any choice. I feel like I'm on a railroad and we're just following a preset track. Giving them a choice and then moving things around or punishing them to force them back on the railroad is trying to give them the illusion and option of choice and then disregarding their choice. To me, what David's talking about is the Quantum Ogre is like, I've prepped this adventure tonight. This is the only adventure I have prepped. I'm going to give you guys the option of going right or left, but your choice really doesn't matter because I've only got this one thing prepped, so I'm going to move it no matter where you go. And to you, you're going to feel like you had the choice. Oh, I wonder what it would have happened if I would have went right instead of left. Spoiler alert, same fucking thing. Or, okay, well, I'm not going to go down that obvious dark hole into hell. Let's go find the nearest tavern. Oh my God, you're run over by boulders. Oh my God, oh shit. I guess the other way is safer. Yeah, I agree. That's like a very negative, pejorative term for, oh, you're on the tracks, or, oh, the GM's railroading me. He's just driving over steamrolling all my apparent choices. I understand why GMs do the Quantum Railroad or the Quantum Ogre. I get it. I didn't prepare for something. But I'm going to say this. When you do that, you may have a more comfortable session. Your players may never find out or even realize that you did it. But you're cheating yourself out of growing as a storyteller, and you're cheating your players out of a possibly better adventure.
Well, and I think that's the crux of it is you've just cheated yourself and the players out of finding out what was to the left.
Right. For a GM, as somebody you're as much a player in this, because you don't know what's going to happen either. You've got to be entertained too, buddy. Don't let them be amazed by your story. You're growing this story. You've got to be a member of the audience as well as the prime mover.
Well, and again, this comes back to the whole your story, my story, our story. The fucking thing I keep hearing from GMs is this idea that, well, players don't bring a story to the table. Well, players do bring a story to the table. They bring their character's story to the table. What you bring is the story of the world to the table. And when you add your piece and their piece together, you get the story. But that's the thing. You've got a piece, they've got a piece. Together, you have the full thing. And a great example of this, just to use very broad strokes, is World War II doesn't happen if every time the Axis decides to take over another country, the Allies don't engage with them and go to war. If Britain, France, and Russia don't go, well, maybe we should stop this Hitler guy from taking over all of Europe, then there is no World War II. It doesn't matter if I'm sitting here as the GM going, I'm going to tell this great World War II story. If my players, Britain, France, and Russia decide, we like Germany, we're just going to pile around with him instead of stopping him, well, then we're going to find a whole new story to tell because we're not telling the original story.
Hey, we are trying to provoke a fight here. Hey, we want rematch. Why are you not rematching us? Okay, we go to France and have bagels.
So I mean, there's absolutely the aspect of it's all well and good to have that A plot that you want to tell, and it's great to know how to bring it back around to it in different ways. And I think the most skillful way avoids the quantum ogre. It avoids the plot wagon, and instead it's what Chris did. Well, I'll just write this whole other adventure that ends up bringing them back to where I need them to be to continue the A plot, or at the very least, it puts them in a position where they have the choice to re-engage with the A plot versus, oh, well, they went this way. I guess I have to have them captured some other way. I guess I have to do X to punish them and force them back on the railroad.
Yeah.
I think that it's a lot easier in Savage Worlds to actually create an adventure on the fly because you can reskin a lot of things. Like you can take, if something is like, I know the goblin is in the core book. If something is just smaller though, like you can take the stats for a cat or you can take the stats for a goblin. You can say it's something different. It can have a different quirk or motivation. Like I have an example. Take the goblin from the deluxe book and give it the ability to fly. What kind of creature is that now?
That's an ass blaster from Tremors.
Yeah. No, seriously. It can be.
I love that that's where you jump to. It's Tremors.
Yeah, no. Take
Tremors 2.
Take the Great Worm from the deluxe core book, and instead of have it like that's the final boss of the campaign, but shrink it down to maybe dog size. Take the stats and just get it to the size and stats of a dog, and you've got the basic graboids. Jared, you just created, if they go left, Savage Tremors. Yeah. Like right there, the goblin is the ass blaster. That's your adventure.
And here's the thing, too. So when they turn left, when they make a left turn at Albuquerque and go completely off the rails, and you had a combat plan, doesn't mean you have to insert a combat when they turn left to Albuquerque.
Mm-hmm.
It could be a whole new. They could be the orphanage has been burnt down. Oh, please help us, sir. I mean, it could be we run into this spooky tavern in the middle of nowhere, and we're told avoid the moors, steer clear the moors.
My bitch ass ain't going anywhere near the moors.
So yeah. It could be like the adventure doesn't have to be, and I think here's where a lot of it comes from, especially if you're running scripted adventures. Instead of focusing on, I'm going to read this plot point campaign, this one session, 5 different ways, so I'm very, very comfortable with everything in it so that I don't have any surprises when I run it. Instead of that being your mentality should be, wait a minute, let me read all the plot point adventures so I have an idea of the grand scope of the world and the story it's trying to tell. When you're familiar with your own world, player characters turning left at Albuquerque is not a big deal because you kind of know organically what is kind of left or kind of right. And you can also gauge it based and give them like some pacing with giving them a bit of a respite.
And I don't disagree with that, but the problem is that doesn't help when running a plot point campaign. And one of the things I think it was Manuel and some of the other hosts on their show actually specifically talked about was this idea of taking a plot point campaign and using it as a jumping off point to create your own. I know, like Harrison Hunt talked about how, you know, he might have used some of the Savage Tales and a few of the plot point adventure ideas from the Solomon Kane adventure, but he completely ran his own thing. And that's fine, but that doesn't actually help you run the plot point campaign. That helps you use the plot point campaign to tell your own story. If you really do want to run the plot point campaign, the tool you have to be most ready to use is the Savage Tale, the secondary B plot that you write based on the character's actions that always leads back in some way to a plot hook for the main plot A, and then familiarize yourself enough with the entire A story so that when the players don't do something, the world goes on and that story advances naturally the way it would if the players don't get involved. And to a certain extent, depending on what you're playing, sooner or later, the players are going to feel the moral need to engage with plot A because they've let half the world burn by going off and doing all these side quests. Because, you know, this isn't a video game where plot A will stay on hold while you do the side quests. No, as a GM, you go, okay, well, that took them 3 days, and in that time, the gym burns down and a chupacabra eats 3 students.
And you can reintroduce that by little devices here and there, gossip on campus, news stories on the evening news that lead to that. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a point where you basically find a way to allow the characters to re-engage or cross paths with the plot point again. Now, I'll say this too. There's something valid to sitting down with your players at session 0 and going, hey, I need a gunslinger, or I need a hex slinger, I need a blessed, I need this because we're going to run the flood. And if everybody's okay with it, you just say, hey, we're going to run the flood. And you tell them, hey, this is kind of a railroady adventure plot kind of laid out for us to let us, you know, get a sense of Deadlands as a world. And then once we finish the plot point campaign, or if we need a break, we could just say, hey, in the middle of it, yeah, you know what? I need a break from this. We could run a couple Savage Tales and come back to it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with pulling the curtain back and having a session 0 conversation going, hey, we're going to run this on the rails.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing wrong. And I think that's required. If you're going to run a plot point campaign in kind of the Gary style where, you know, I'm going to drop my head and I'm going to bull through this as quickly as I can so that we can go play this other thing next, I think you have to tell your players up front that that's what you're going to do. Now, we did get another thing here on the Quantum Ogre, and I just want to touch on it real quick. What was it? Sam, is a Quantum Ogre really quantum if the possibility of the ogre encounter was in the mix but wasn't necessarily planned for spot X? And this is where I'm going to kind of say, now you're adding sandbox to the equation. If you have a little box of index cards, and each index card is a room in the dungeon, and you just pull those index cards out, shuffle them up, and take the top 5 of them, it doesn't matter what direction the players go. They come around that corner and turn the card over. That's the encounter that's waiting for them. Hey, that's a great, you know, adventure designer technique to just put you on the spot to constantly have to jump through hoops. If you just want to have in your back pocket 10 adventures you can run at any given time, those are great tools to have, but be aware that it is to a certain extent still the Quantum Ogre that I'm going to run X. It's not, I put it in a specific spot, but this is what I'm running, despite what the players chose. It should be because what the players chose. The players choose to go ogre hunting, you drop the ogre on them. The players choose to go dragon hunting, they don't find an ogre, they find a dragon. You have to engage with the choices the players are making. That's what makes a Quantum Ogre, is when you take what you thought and put it in place of what the players are choosing. That's what makes a quantum ogre a quantum ogre.
Because it exists in multiple places at once, whether you want it to or not. That's the quantum and the quantum ogre, right?
Well, this is a phasing ogre, and it's going to phase to wherever you go.
Right.
I am not above using lures. A lot of times I will actually try and utilize my players' hindrances to kind of squeeze them a little bit. But if I have some really, really bad ADHD cats, one of the things that I'll do is I will take stock of my players and I will say, okay, so here's what you got to do. You have to create an NPC dependent. You have to create somebody that sort of grounds your character into the world. There's somebody that you know. And then that NPC will find themselves in trouble, or they'll be really helpful, but in order to be helpful with what the players want, the players are going to need to do them a favor or get them an item, which just happens to be somewhere along where that is. I think a lot of times, like this whole concept of I go left when I should go right, you know, there are methods, there are motivations as to why people do the things that they do. And if you can use a lure, or you know the players' hindrances or their connections to the world, or you can get the players grounded in the world that they're playing in instead of just being like in a murder simulator, then you can sort of get inside their head and pull them towards the section of the plot point campaign.
So let's talk about this for just a second, Dave. I just want to kind of have this as a real quick thought experiment. So I, as a GM, am kind of creating this world. And here's the thing. I don't have a very definite idea of what's happening in every nook and cranny of this world. However, I know I'm running this style and tone of game. So I have some plot ideas, some adventure seed ideas. Like, oh, you know what? At some point, the players run across a serial killer who tries to murder them. Okay, I'll stick that in the fishbowl as an idea. Oh, or maybe they run across this person who is very, very charitable, and they're giving all this money to the poor, but find out they're murdering rich people to get it. Put that in and I have these sort of thematic plot ideas. So am I necessarily quantum ogring if I'm running an open sandbox and go, you know what? Based on what the players have done already so far, this seems like a really good place to insert the serial killer idea and flesh that out a little bit. Not quantum ogre, right? I mean, if it's organically part of the story and fits in narratively with where the characters have gone so far and also fits the theme, am I doing the players a disservice? Let me ask that.
So I guess my response to that would be, if as a GM, I have gone ahead and I've prepared, like I said, the little box of index cards, and each index card is an adventure or an encounter, and I know that these are the things that I'm interested in having happen. And then the players do something that would engage with something similar to what I have in the box, and I pull it out of the box and throw it down. That's not a quantum. That is, I'm holistically reacting to what the players are choosing to do and throwing a hand grenade in the room with them in the form of this thing that I had idea, the serial killer or whatnot. If the reverse is, I tease the idea that there's a serial killer going around, killing people, and the players choose that instead of that plot hook, they glom onto this plot hook about going off to this fort that's 3 states away instead. That's the plot hook they've decided that they're going to chase. And I say, well, lo and behold, the first house they come to happens to have the serial killer that I've written up. They chose not to go into that plot point, but that's the adventure I put in their path, because for me, I really want to see how they react. That to me is stepping very close to Quantum Ogrehood, because now I've said, regardless of what the players chose, they're going to run into the serial killer. Now, if the story I run is just they cross paths with the serial killer, but they're not having to investigate that it's a serial killer or anything, you can kind of get away with that. But I think once you start down that path, it becomes very tempting to go full Quantum Ogre and just kind of throw that plot point in front of them regardless of what they've chosen. Right. And that's where that danger point is. Because again, you're denying yourself to go, well, what else would have been along the path to that fort that's 3 days travel away or whatever. Okay.
And I wanted to ask that question specifically to the comment you dropped for Art Fernandez as sort of a segue into that question. So go ahead.
So Art put a question here, and it's actually a really good one. Art Fernandez says, what about talking to one of the players and that player can help steer the team back to plot A? There's 2 versions of this. One is really, really bad. The other is a mixed bag. So the really, really bad one is I bring in a ringer solely for the point of having a second GM at the table.
Right.
To act as the plot wagon that's constantly running the players over whenever they make the bad choice. That's just as bad as me hitting them with lightning bolts, or right goes to the story, left goes to a pack of 50 ninjas chewing bubblegum. That is a bad maneuver by a GM. And if this other player is there and you've told them the story in advance, what point do they have in playing the game? At that point, it's not a cooperative story. It's their job to suddenly make the players engage with the story that you've told them they have to run.
Right. This becomes like cattle rustling of your players, right? Like, no. We want the herd to cross the Rio Grande, but only on a specific way. No. Let me drag you back on. You got a little bit off track there, Dosey. We drag you back on track. We push you back on track. Let me lead you back on track. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
No matter how you do it, you're just engaging the aid of another player at the table to collude with you and help you do it.
You're not using lightning bolts in a plot wagon, but you are using a sheepdog to constantly herd the cats in the right direction, and it's the same thing.
Right. What is the players? At what point do you go, you know what? Screw plot A. They obviously do not want to engage with plot A.
Well, then at that point, I think this is where you have the adult conversation and go, hey guys, we were running Degrees of Horror. We were running The Flood, and you guys have gone completely off the wall. Do you want me to stop dropping those in front of you and we'll just continue to play ETU, Deadlands, whatever? Or, do we want to swing back around and course correct? Give the players that choice. Let them know, hey, this has gotten out of hand and we're not going to be able to see that story. So if you guys want to see the story, we got to go back to it. If not, I'll just stop throwing it in front of you because clearly you don't want to do it. We're going to, I'll just keep doing the stuff that you show you have interest in. I think that's an interesting conversation to have, but not to run away from Art's question. There is still the mixed bag version of having a ringer in the party, and that is you get the guy who takes Code of Honor, the guy who takes Heroic, the guy who takes Curious. Oh, buddy. That is your best friend as a GM when it comes to dragging players back to the A plot. Because now I put the damsel in distress on plot A's tracks. I put the honorable choice on plot A's tracks. I put the big mystery right behind the door to plot A's tracks. You can absolutely utilize the things on your characters' character sheets to drag them kicking and screaming back to the main plot. But again, they have to make that choice based on that hindrance. You can't force it, but it's certainly a way to have a player act as your agent without realizing they're acting as your agent. And that's the key there is, yes, I'm going to have player A be the little GM who could and direct the players back on the plot point. But I'm never telling them that that's what they're doing. I'm just dangling the piece of fish out that's way too delectable to miss.
I want to go ahead. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to say, going along with that, Dave, it's a matter of their concept. Like, as a GM, I think it's important to know your character's concept, and at a certain point, like, you know, okay, take a drink, folks. Have that adult conversation where you just look at the person and ask. You have to ask some players, what is your concept here? Where are you going with this? You know, like you could say, well, I wanted my character to be a face, but now they're changing more into a mage. I'm like, okay, well, I wanted my character to be like, you know, this, you know, clever sort of dangerous assassin / waitress. Things can be all kinds of different stuff, but sometimes you really do. If you have to herd cats, you have to look at them and say, where are you going?
I'm just kind of like I mean, we're really building this around the conceit of running a plot point campaign, and you've got to just there has to be buy-in that we're going to run the story, right? I mean,
right, and that's going along with what I'm saying, Jared, is that if you have someone who has gone off the rails at character creation, at the basic concept, like let's say you're playing Deadlands and you're playing Deadlands Reloaded and they want to play Carney. Okay, you're like, all right, so are you from a traveling show? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, how did you get to be a Carney? What are you doing on the train at the time? I don't know, just work it in. No, buddy. No. Look, you have a certain responsibility as the player to have that concept in this campaign. And if you want that agency, you have the responsibility of having a concept as well. And maybe it is the GM's responsibility to help shape that through the gameplay, but you have to start with something.
Well, and I think that's one of those situations where the session zero is penultimately important, and so is the ability as a GM to kind of put your foot down and say no.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, this also goes back to something that was said earlier in the show, which is, you know the player characters, know their motivations, but also, the players have to make characters that want to engage with that world and want to engage with the game. If we're going to run a zombie survival game, just because it's what we talk about probably second to none on this show, and you start the character with a cornerstone motivation that if they're ever in a no-win situation, they're going to commit suicide. Well, that might make for an interesting character, but you might as well start rolling up character number 2 before you introduce that character to the game, because you've just created a character that's not going to engage with the end of the world apocalypse. They're instead going to put a gun in their mouth or hang themselves or take poison or however they choose to go about it. You might have an interesting one-shot character that adds a lot to the atmosphere of that game and even acts as a great motivator for the other characters to continue to survive. And you might pitch that exact concept to the GM during session 0 and get away with it, but it's not a long-term campaign character. And I think that's the other aspect of this. When we start talking about railroads, there's 2 kinds of railroads. There's the, I'm going to railroad you through tonight's adventure, which is what I like to more refer to as a con game. And there's, I'm going to railroad you through this story And that's the plot point campaign. I don't think outside of those two things, railroads exist anymore. We don't have the idea of the GM who is the antagonist to the players and who has this dungeon that can only be run one direction and all the puzzles only have one answer. The hobby has just gotten away from those things. You know, no one puts to get past door Z, they have to have made notice roll X to find MacGuffin Y so that they can open door Z. No one builds those adventures anymore because we've seen the pitfalls of it. So now when I have a plot point campaign that says, hey, they're supposed to be chasing down this MacGuffin so they can do this thing halfway through the story that leads to this next part where the MacGuffin in the story gets taken away from them and puts them in dire straits. All of those are great things, but they are very much a separate adventure each. They're not all in one night the way they used to be, and they're not written out to be kind of this narrow hallway like they used to be. Even the plot point campaigns, again, come with the Savage Tales, and with if you actually read most plot point campaigns that are released by the licensees, like, it's not written the way an old school module is. This is room 1 and this happens. And there's one connecting corridor that leads to room 2 and this happens. None of the plot point campaigns I've seen have and read this to your player's text box.
Right. Yeah, and I agree too. There's that conceit too when you're doing the session 0. To bring it back to the zombie game we're playing again, is like, you know, a player character going, no, he's a badass military ranger. He's got D12 shooting and all the combat edges ever, and he's a zombie killing, kicking ass machine. Well, that's great, but that's not the story we're telling. We're talking about normal survivors, normal everyday people trying to get through and survive this thing. He may eventually become that guy. Once, you know, if he lives long enough through the apocalypse, he may eventually become that guy. But no, you're not starting out as an action movie star in a survival horror game. Sorry, we're not building that character necessarily.
What is that guy doing there?
That game has the conceit that everyone it has to start off as regular people, and there's even an edge that you can take if you want to start off the ultra trained Marine that happens to be there in the breakout. If you're playing Zombieland, you absolutely,
yes.
I mean, that character is completely viable, and I don't you have to know the tone of the game you're running, so that during session 0, you know when to shut a character concept down, not because it's not a good Savage Worlds character, not because, you know, it's a bad character for X genre, but because the story we're going to play tonight or over the next several days isn't the type that needs that character. It needs Carol, not Rick. Again, shorthand for those who watch the show enough to know, you know, what we're referring to here. You can absolutely, you know, achieve a lot of this even by just saying, hey guys, what I need all of you to roll up a character based kind of on a coworker that you know, somebody that would just exist in the real world. Or, hey, you know what, we're going to play Conan, and what I need all of you to write up is a hero.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to take heroic, but you have to be a hero.
Right. Or we're saying,
play, you know, Mafia, each and every one of you is a backstabber.
Yep.
You're out for yourself.
Or the Chris example, the Chris Savage Flying Fox example. Oh, we're going to do Deadlands Noir. You're all working for a detective agency. No, you cannot create an assassin.
Yeah.
Not that I don't want you to play, but it's not going to work with the story we're trying to tell. The conceit is you're all gumshoes. You're working for a detective agency.
Why are you working for the detective agency? And no, it can't be this convoluted second A plot.
Right. Yeah, so there's a bit of a conceit that, and hey, if we're going to run a plot point campaign, we're going to need this kind of character or party makeup.
And I mean,
some flexibility in building that.
That circles back to the same conversation where you're going to have about tone anyway, where you're setting up the no-go zones and things like that for the story. Maybe you're doing the end of the world apocalypse, and the no-go zone is no one can talk about suicide. So you have to build characters that would never contemplate it. Or, maybe you're playing in the new Wise Guys thing, but the conceit is no one is going to get into drugs because it's just not done by the Italian mafia. So all of the player characters agree. All the players agree they're going to play a character that wants nothing to do with drugs. Or you're playing, vice versa. You're going to play, a Tropicana game where everyone is into drugs and no one is going to go into child trafficking or pornography trafficking or racketeering, anything.
Or assassination.
Yeah, you can have those conversations of tone right away that immediately become the thing you can point to and go, well, no, you can't play that character because it violates that tone thing we just talked about.
Right. Spoiler warning for a 4 to 5 decade old movie. For those of you who have seen The Godfather, the reason why they put the hit out on Corleone is because he was involved in gambling and refused to get involved in drugs. So if you start the game as in his party and he is the giver of quests, going up against him makes you an enemy to the family. So if you get involved in those things, that's sort of a world constraint.
Yep. All right. Well, do you have anything left in the group chat that we want to discuss? Any other questions or anything, comments we want to address?
According to Art Fernandez, assassination is the highest form of civil service.
I mean,
I don't think Archduke Ferdinand would agree.
I don't think he's wrong, but
I mean, you just need. Yeah, we're gonna avoid this one. I had wisecracks, but I don't want to get lagged.
No, I think the only thing I would add to this is to kind of wrap a bow on it is, again, I'm not trying to portray the good old-fashioned railroad as being bad or wrong, but it certainly is something that if you're going to do it because you chose to do it. Don't do it because you're making sloppy GM choices of taking away the player's agency and the choices that they're making to make the game more fun for themselves.
Right. And yeah, I would say kill the Quantum Ogre. More Blue Oyster Cult. Don't fear the Quantum Ogre. Embrace the scary improv in the moment. Oh God, I didn't have anything prepared. Where do they go? What would be around the corner? Okay. All right. You run into an orphanage. And as a GM, it's okay not to know what's going to happen. It's all right. You can come up with things on the fly in the moment. Let your improv muscle kind of grow with that. It's not a win-lose proposition. It's okay. Well, we're taking an interesting diversion. We're gonna see what's behind door number 3 that I don't have planned, and I don't even know what building door number 3 is attached to. Hey, what is it?
Ogres have layers. Just peel back the next layer.
Wait a minute. The headmistress of the orphanage is a witch? What? Wait, the orphanage is really a whole hallucination and a mirage? What? So,
okay, sucker punch.
I mean, also too, let your players tell you what it is. I mean, the whole weight of the storytelling doesn't have to fall on the GM's shoulders. It doesn't. You can just sort of like tell the players, well, I don't know what's going on here. You guys tell me. What do you see? What do you think's going on? And then roll with that.
If you want like a master class in how you don't use Quantum Ogre, you literally let the players go batshit wild and still tie it back to the A plot. Watch the movie Sucker Punch.
Yeah.
I mean, that movie. One adventure is freaking Weird Wars 2. The next adventure is for Savage Rifts. The third adventure is Deadlands. And by the way, the entire time we're really playing Deadlands Noir.
Right. What's with the huge kaiju monster battle and the jumping katanas? What?
This is either the most awesome game ever, or our GM needs to lay off the edibles.
The GM had a stroke every night.
It's like, it all smells like toast.
The GM goes, God, I don't know. Crazy Nazis show up. All right, here we go. All right. So on that note, until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Dave, the Rules Baby Scott, and Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith, saying keep rolling and stay savage.